Welcome to The Forest Garden, a podcast for gardeners who want to upgrade their landscapes into biodiverse food forest systems. On today's episode of The Forest Garden, we are happy to be talking with Joe and Phoebe Krofchick of Field and Forest Products. As many of you listeners may know, cultivating biodiversity in a forest garden setting goes way beyond edible plants. Today, join us as we delve into the world of outdoor mushroom cultivation. Stick with us. Phoebe and Joe of Field and Forest, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to hear about everything that Field and Forest has been doing in terms of mushroom cultivation. I personally have ordered from y'all a few times, but only wine cap mushroom spawn. In terms of what we want to hear about today, or what I personally want to hear about, is really kind of things in the forest gardening context or in outdoor cultivation of mushrooms. But before we get into that, just to start us off, why don't we sort of cover how Field and Forest got started, maybe what the initial interest or background is there, and yeah, we'll just go from there.
Well, I'll try to give you the Reader's Digest version because our history starts approximately 40 years ago. My wife, Mary Ellen, and I were living in Madison, Wisconsin at the time, and I was working for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources as a field botanist as part of an acid rain study. And an article came across my desk from the Forest Products Lab on the cultivation of shiitake on small diameter logs. The subtitle was "A New Potential Billion-Dollar Industry for the U.S." So I read it and I said, wow, this is right up our alley because we're looking for a small business to get into. We want to live in northern Wisconsin, and we had access to land that had the raw material, small diameter hardwoods. So we hemmed and hawed about this for a year. Great, but we should also do small fruit crops at the same time, right? Strawberries, blueberries, and raspberries. And that's how Field and Forest came about. The field was the strawberry, blueberries, and raspberry crops. And the forest products were shiitake and shiitake spawn. Well, as luck would have it, we had good connections in Madison at the Forest Products Lab. They got us started on spawn production. And from there, it was hop on the learning curve and let her rip. The field products kind of fell by the wayside. So we no longer cultivate blueberries or small fruits on a commercial scale. Well, we certainly do mushrooms and mushroom spawn as our main and sole business right now.
That's kind of how it started, and I can bring it up to speed to where we are today. So my name is Phoebe, and I do a lot of the media here, as in social media, and then also video creation and things more on the education side of things. My main goal here is to make mushroom growing accessible to everyone that might not know anything about it, and really basic ways that you can grow mushroom, either in an urban setting or in a rural setting. But so I joined the company, one could say, kind of since birth. The co-founders, Joe and Mary Ellen, are my parents. But really, I joined the company full-time in a professional capacity about 2 years ago. And it's just really interesting to see how the business has changed, in the last 30 years, being based on their home farm to putting up a facility that strictly works in spawn production and getting that, shipped out, nationwide to folks who want to grow mushrooms.
Yeah, that all sounds really interesting. So, Joe, when you started the company back in so many years ago, how many people were doing this?
Oh boy, I could probably count them on one hand. The paper written by the Forest Products Lab was really the first push to make the public aware of shiitake to begin with, and then the possibility of cultivating it here in the U.S. So in the early 80s, I would say there were probably 3 companies that were involved with the small scale cultivation of shiitake on natural logs. Growers, commercial, they were non-existent, because the industry really was in its infancy back in 1983. It took quite a few years for shiitake cultivation to get established in the US. And even now, in terms of education, shiitake is still, it can be called one of the great unknowns still in mushroom cultivation because there are people who still aren't aware that it's a mushroom that can be cultivated. So 2 generations later, we're still focusing on one of our main starting points, and that was education to people who have an interest in mushroom cultivation using readily available local materials. Since then, we've seen the industry grow to where it is today, where there's all sorts of commercial cultivators nationwide, for anywhere from tens of thousands of logs to 5 logs in the backyard. So that's where we are today. But way back when, boy, we were just starting how to learn to ride a bike back then.
And are you also seeing increased interest from just independent growers, just hobbyists, enthusiasts?
Yeah, it's been on the rise. Like any other specialty crop, we've seen it have its ups and downs depending upon how hard certain states were peddling it. When tobacco money, for instance, came available with tobacco fund settlement, there was a big push for alternative agriculture there. So we saw a spike in growers at that time, and then, there was a decrease, and then, organics brought it back. So it's been, let's say, a swell and swale kind of curve. But recently, it's really found its foothold, and the number of growers is really steadfastly increasing. A lot of that has to do with the pandemic. People are stuck at home, and a lot of people really, how many times do we hear, I've been meaning to do this for years, and now I have the time to do it. So as a result of that, a lot of people got involved in home cultivation, and we've seen spin-offs from that into people going from home cultivation to, for instance, a small hobby farm where they can serve a local farm market, or maybe they're selling at a farm market along the roadside. So yeah, we've seen everything in the last few years in terms of growth.
Yeah, as far as growth goes, I mean, both commercially, a lot of people have gotten into it, but also just as a hobbyist, because there are so many projects you can do in mushroom cultivation that you can do with young kids, and it's a great education process. Also, I mean, with the rise of multiple documentaries coming out, the interest has been there kind of just across the board. So yeah, it definitely has really taken off in the last couple of years. It's been a steady grow, but then a really big boom with the pandemic.
Yeah, you can buy them at Home Depot. They sell fruiting kits at your local superstore now, which is crazy to think about. Which I don't necessarily advocate, not necessarily supporting these big box stores, but it's wild how it's hit the mainstream.
And if it gets people to start growing them, and if that's their first step, then that's awesome. If that's, if there's someone's going into Home Depot and being like, oh, this is possible, this is something I can do, that's all more power to them.
Yeah, I suppose if they're going there already to find a new spade for their gardening project, and then they're like, whoa, hey, what's this new thing? And then get totally invested in it. Yeah. Right. And actually thinking back, I bought one of those during the pandemic before I even knew about Field and Forest, and before I even knew about all of the, mushroom possibilities out there. And before I watched the documentaries that you mentioned, like Fantastic Fungi or some of those. And the first thing that I really got into was I ordered a thing of wine cap spawn. And I did that because I read online saying, you put this spawn in the ground under some wood chips and it fruits and it comes back year after year, which to me was totally crazy. In a way, I think of wine cap mushroom species as a sort of perennial because the spawn has a sort of long lasting effect where it can come back in a cold climate, which I had never thought was possible outdoors. And that's one of the questions that I have for the two of you. For our listeners, maybe we should just talk about wine caps for a bit and about how long they might come back or what the expectancy that is there. Because something that I'm not totally familiar with is how long lived all of the different mushroom strains that you offer are, and some of the outdoor ones and some of the ones that are grown in different substrates.
With wine cap, there's of course many variables to how long a bed will last and how long it will come back. Typically, we say at least 2 seasons. It really depends on the depth of your bed primarily, and also what you're using for it. Most people do use wood chips as their base, but you can also use straw or a combination of both. And if it's a straw bed, usually it will last, one season, maybe two, depending on how much wood chips you have a component of that bed. And then also like your location. So we're in northern Wisconsin, and our beds typically last 2 to 3 years. A wood chip bed will last 2 to 3 years before we would want to kind of reinvigorate or invigorate that bed with more spawn. But in the South, where their rate of decay is just so much faster than us, they either have to make their beds very deep, or it's typically a 1 year project.
It's real interesting. It's a mushroom that is native. And if you go back to like the early 90s, it was unheard of in terms of cultivation. And then by the late 1990s, we were hearing about people wood chipping their yards with wood chips they purchased at a big box store, and they were getting these strange mushrooms. And as it turns out, those are wine cap. And it really wasn't until maybe 10 years ago that wine cap cultivation really came into its own in the US. The demand for wine cap spawn is phenomenal. And the beauty of it is that it's easy. It can be done in an urban lot. It can be done, in a rural setting, and it can be done in a lot of different places where other fungi are more specific. So it's really it's a generalist. And another thing, the beauty of it, and I'm pretty sure if you take a look online or at the Mushroom Minute, wine cap is probably one of the best things you can do for your soil. Wine cap is an amazing decay organism. So a bed made with straw and wood chips, in a couple of years here in the north, we can really transform that top layer of soil to one that's really rich in organic matter for other fungi and other plants to take advantage of.
Yeah, so I was just at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station for their sort of annual shindig, and there was someone there who was promoting wine caps as an additional crop for people who have Christmas tree farms, which because they mulch and it was sort of it was an experiment, it was proposed, but I thought, genius, right? Like how cool would that be? And you're building the soil for the Christmas trees to give them better growth and to retain moisture and all the rest, and getting a crop out of it, which is so cool. And I should mention that I'm in zone 6B, maybe kind of like borderline 7A, and Ben is in California in zone 9. And something that I think about, I have siblings who live in the tropics, and they both are very interested in food forests and cultivation of all sorts of different edibles. I would like to send them some mushroom spawn, but I'm not really sure how they would perform there. And so when you talked about the rate of decay and sort of the cold hardiness, that's something that I personally am also really interested in. If you're in the South, or let's say you're in Hawaii in the tropics, or you're in zone 6 in Connecticut, what is the different experience in terms of cultivating not only wine caps, but all sorts of mushrooms?
Yeah, so I will say that we have people growing this wine cap and all, different mushroom varieties just about everywhere. We actually have had people from Puerto Rico get spawn before, oyster mushrooms primarily. So it's definitely possible to grow mushrooms down there. I would say as far as, it really depends on your microclimate as well. So if it also, like I say, the South, the rate of decay, that in Florida is going to be a lot different than that in California, just based on, your humidity levels. We have someone in Sacramento who grows wine caps successfully. And as you probably know, it's hot there, it's dry there, but it's possible. It really depends on how you're manipulating your specific area as far as what kind of moisture management you're putting into your bed, or as far as where exactly you're planting it. There's a lot of just natural areas that will be for, like somewhere in, say Alabama, there are going to be places like just that are like little hollows that are going to be cooler. And that's where wine cap is going to, find its natural place that it wants to live. As far as, and generally most mushrooms prefer, I would say they like warm temperatures for mycelium run, but as far as fruiting bodies, they're oftentimes stimulated temperature changes. So warm days, cool nights. So it's really possible. It's not a matter of so much where you can grow them, but when the mushrooms will actually appear.
Yeah, we're trying to figure out the furthest south that we've had reliable wine cap results. And I want to say Central Florida is about as far south as we can push it, because it just gets too hot, but it stays too hot during the remainder of the year. because wine cap is triggered by changes in drops in temperature coupled with rainfall. So typically here it's a spring phenomena and a fall phenomena. The tropics would be really, really a challenge for this species. But there's other mushrooms that the tropics would love, like almond agaricus. That one is native to the subtropics, and that grows on compost. So there's definitely a mushroom that would grow that far south. Now, other fungi, once again, Vivi brought up a great point. It's really choosing the local microclimate that will be suitable for the fungus to rot the substrate that it's growing on. Let's say, for instance, shiitake. Well, we sell a lot of shiitake down in Florida, Georgia, where it's hot and humid, but management can be done where those logs grow quite well and fruit quite well. We have, we call it CARS 1, or California Research Site 1 in Sacramento, and they're growing shiitake there. Now, granted, it's really dry, and there's a lot of unknowns about the wood, but it does work because he does manage for water and he does have good shade. If you take a look at what you have available in terms of microclimate, substrate availability for all these different fungi, chances are you'll be able to grow something somewhere.
Now, does strain play a factor in this too? I'm noticing that on your website, you guys mentioned that you have quite a few different strains of the different mushrooms you offer, and that's something that I've had to wrap my mind around. I mean, I'm familiar with cultivars and ecotypes and strains of plants, but of course, it also exists in the mushroom cultivation world. Are there different strains that people should consider?
Well, most certainly. One of the biggest things that confuse people is lumping strains into categories. For instance, if you take a look through our website or catalog, we have 3 distinct classes of strains: cold weather shiitake, warm weather shiitake, and wide range shiitake. The thought used to be way back when that, well, because we're in northern Wisconsin, we need a cold weather shiitake strain. Well, that's not the case. The temperature breakdowns are based upon the seasonality of fruiting. So cold weather strains typically will spawn and fruit spring and fall when temperatures are cool. We sell a lot of cold weather strains into the southeast US because it's too hot to grow mushrooms in the summer. But boy, can they grow them in the fall, winter, and spring. And that's where cold weather strains come real handy. Well, for first-time growers, wide range strains are really the way to go because they're these to cultivate and they are adaptable to a wide variety of wood.
Yeah, and again, just to go back to that point that, a lot of these strains, a lot of these varieties, like I said before, it's not, necessarily your geographic location that dictates it. It's sort of just your seasonality. So it's not necessarily like if it will fruit, it's a when it will fruit phenomena.
Thank you so much for all that amazing info. I feel like I'm getting the mushroom download of the century here.
Yeah.
I knew about almond agaricus, and I saw your mushroom minutes, which once again I have to commend Phoebe for her incredible just social media skills. But the mushroom minutes on the almond agaricus, I saw that you guys were growing them in high tunnels, and so I thought, maybe this is a strain that would do well for my siblings who live in the tropics. But I couldn't find any examples of people in the tropics who were growing them. And so then I just sort of got a little uncertain about the idea, and I found a few people who had tried growing wine caps and failed in Hawaii. So it's good to know. I mean, that would be a good experiment to do. In terms of cultivating the almond agaricus in the high tunnels that you do, could we talk about that for a little bit? Because that's something that, I would love to have another species of mushroom growing in my backyard, and I also do have a high tunnel.
Yeah, absolutely. A big thing that we do here at Field and Forest Products is a lot of research, and primarily we use the high tunnel to mimic climates that are further south than us because, we're very limited with, I think we're in zone 4B, 5A technically.
Mm-hmm.
We can't mimic a zone 9 unless we have a high tunnel. So that almond agaricus, it really is that subtropic species. So it doesn't necessarily need a high tunnel in our zone. but it really thrives under one. It really likes the heat. It really likes the humidity. What we like to do is actually companion plant it with, tomatoes or summer squash, because it A, gets hot in that high tunnel, and B, those companion plants kind of trap and localize the humidity around the mushroom, which makes for a really great environment for it. So that is one of the ways that we try to, kind of mimic what the weather might be, quite a bit south of us, but also for us to find a way that it's really going to thrive in ways that you can make it thrive in the more northern climates. On the same thing, we grow reishi in our greenhouse just because, they do great in the Carolinas and further south, but trying to cultivate them up north, we don't have the heat, we don't have the humidity that they really like to, grow and thrive and be the high producing mushroom that they can be. So that's primarily what we use the high tunnel for, is to mimic those other locations and try to find the best ways to grow them, in our climate.
Yeah, no, I think it's fantastic, especially, I mean, there's so many northern growers out there who are in zone 4 or are in, northern Maine and have high tunnels and are maybe not cultivating mushrooms in them. So really amazing stuff.
Yeah, so the great thing about it too is it's not something that they have to dedicate an entire high tunnel to. They can add it with their crops and do a little like polyculturing with it, which is great for the soil, but also, saves on space.
For sure. A lot of the times when you find online, I kind of hate the term companion planting, in quotes. I'm air quoting here, because frequently what you find online is someone's like, put marigolds right next to your tomatoes and all your problems will be solved. And it's just like, oh God, that's not how that works. But yeah, no, but the mushrooms, oh my God, it does work. It really does work. So with almond agaricus, is it the same as wine caps where you can expect them to come back for at least 2 to 3 years?
Well, let me put it this way. In our situation, it's an annual crop because we have this season called winter, and man, it gets cold, and those subtropical species just don't cut it up here. So when a greenhouse freezes up into winter, that's about it's the goodbye for anything almond agaricus related in our greenhouse.
Yeah, almond agaricus really can't survive in temperatures under 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I would even say 45, it really starts to suffer. So for us, that typically hits in October. We'll see the last gasps of an almond agaricus, show itself in September, and then it will fade. And that's even in a high tunnel production.
Gotcha. So definitely maybe more one for growers in the South and in, Georgia, in the moist mushroom zones.
And a lot longer growing season too.
For sure. Ben, do you have a question? I feel once again am monopolizing the interview.
Oh, sure. I mean, one question I have, maybe we can transition away from the almond agaricus, and kind of a basic question, but I think it might bring some value to people who may be less familiar with mushroom cultivation. Phoebe, you spoke a little bit about this idea of the fungi myceliating versus fruiting. And so is it a good way to think, maybe if we put ourselves in the mind of the mushroom, what is it a pretty distinct difference between a colonization phase versus a fruiting phase? And what are the triggers or the environmental factors?
Yeah, so I can certainly start with this, and then I'm sure Joe will take over and give a more scientific explanation. But essentially, the mycelium, they're just the mushroom roots, and what they do is they find something that it can convert from a substrate into a food. So let's take shiitake and a log. What you'll have is anywhere from a 9 to 18 month period where that mycelium is making its way through that log. And then usually at some point there's a temperature drop or there's a big rainfall event. And that's going to, once that mycelium has fully colonized that log, it is ready to create essentially a reproductive body. And so usually when the rain, falls or a temperature drops, that's kind of this, stimulus for that mushroom to be like, something is happening out there in the natural world and I need to get going. So that's when they send up their fruiting bodies. So I don't know if you have a more scientific explanation of that.
That cuts it to the bone pretty well. No, that's the crux of it right there. The original ecology of, let's say, shiitake, which was first cultivated in Japan and China way back when, And what it is, it's shiitake fruits when the typhoon season starts, because you go through a dry period and then, all of a sudden, hey, it's raining out and it's really raining out. And what a trigger that is with a temperature drop for a mushroom to fruit. So that's what it's really based upon. If you take a look at what happens naturally, it's rainfall and a drop in temperature is what gets most of these fungi to do their thing.
And it makes sense that they would fruit after they've finished colonizing the food source that they're currently working on, because if they can't spread, through their mycelium, through the food source any further, then they use their spores to travel through the air, and they time it for seasonally so that it matches up with the rains, increases the chances of success of those spores. So yeah, I think it's helpful, like kind of think through the mind of the mushroom to try to understand. I think that helps with people who are starting out cultivating them.
Absolutely.
So I have a question about storage. I know that the best way to really, to get your mushrooms to last is to pick them at the button stage, which I have to say, I kind of knew that from other sources, but it was really reinforced once again by your Mushroom Minute posts. Beyond that, putting them in a paper bag or a cloth bag and keeping them in the fridge, and it depends on species and how long they last. But other methods of storing them besides refrigeration, I've never pickled mushrooms before. I've never stored them, in a root cellar. Are there other ways besides refrigeration to preserve mushrooms from sort of like a homesteading perspective?
Yes, absolutely. Before I launch off onto, mushroom preservation, I have to say thank you so much for enjoying our mushroom minutes. Like, it's really rewarding to hear, and like, people have told me like, yeah, we love your mushroom minutes, but like, I'm glad you're getting something out of them. That's really rewarding for me to hear. So thank you. Anyway, back to mushroom preservation. So there, you can do a lot of things with them. It is a little bit dependent on the variety of mushroom. Some mushrooms do store better than others and in different ways. So for example, shiitake, you can pickle it and it's fine, but the texture isn't amazing. Really what we prefer to do is actually just do a quick saute, freeze them, and then pull them out during the winter and throw them into soups and sauces and all that good stuff. But shiitake are also very good dried, just because they reconstitute really well and have a good texture. Whereas something like wine cap, if you pick at their button stage, actually make a really good pickle, the mushroom, because, they kind of maintain a little bit more of their crunch than like a slice of a shiitake would. But wine cap don't dry as well. They kind of become crumbly. So it really is kind of pairing your mushroom with a preservation technique. But I would say, like, by and large, the go-to method we have for all these, other than refrigeration and eating fresh, would be to just do a quick saute, freeze them, and then add them to like soups and sauces or pasta dishes or whatever you would like throughout the winter months when you don't have them.
Gotcha. That's really helpful. That's a thing that my friend who is of Polish origin, on the day of fruiting, when a flush happens and there's too many wine caps to eat in any amount of time for a family of, a single family house, we just give them away to anyone who's interested. But for really, that's only my Polish friend and her family, and her mother makes an amazing sauce out of it, which I cannot claim to have the skills to do.
Yeah, well, we definitely feel that. I mean, with the last name of Kravchuk, believe it, we are very ingrained in the Polish roots as well. So preservation of mushrooms and how to cook with them has actually been a very a large part of both the professional life, but then also like our personal lives.
And that's something also that I wanted to bring up to you. I go to UMass, University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a friend of mine there is of Russian descent. And he, he's communicated to me that during foraging trips with his family who grew up in Russia, harvesting mushrooms out there, there's a bunch of different strains of mushrooms that just don't, like, let's say you use a mushroom identification app and it says like, oh, technically edible, but most people don't eat it because like it just doesn't taste that good, or some of them that are even classified as poisonous. And in the US, but in Eastern European cultures and in Russia, these mushrooms have a history of foraging and of preparing in specific ways to make them edible and to make them delicious that just like doesn't exist here. So I don't know if you have any sort of comment on that. I know that's not really a question, but it's something I think about, and it's something that I wish I knew more about. And I don't have, I'm Italian. I lack the cultural history of foraging for mushrooms and recognizing them in the wild.
Well, I would say a large part of that probably just has to do with, the history and just like kind of what's in your culture. So for me, I've grown up mushroom hunting. And so there's not this, there's no like fear factor for me of what may be poisonous or what may not be. There are mushrooms out there that will a lot of people gastric upset where it won't affect other people. I personally actually cannot eat morels without my stomach, getting a little queasy. And there, I would say by and large, the morel is like the most coveted wild mushroom out there. So I think a lot of it has to do with individual reactions to mushrooms in a lot of ways. But then also, there's a lot of mushrooms that aren't considered choice mushrooms that you can certainly eat and people eat a lot of, like, the honey mushroom. A lot of people won't eat that mushroom, but as in Polish culture, they'll certainly go out of their way to harvest it. A lot of it is probably just comfort level and with what you're knowing kind of what your body can handle.
Eastern Europeans has a long history of wild mushroom collection and harvesting and storage. It's just genetically linked. Mushrooms and Eastern Europeans. It's got to be. It's a surreal spectacle to see in the fall of the year. Any train station on a weekend in Eastern Europe is loaded with people with their baskets. And what are they doing? They're going to their summer cottage to harvest wild mushrooms. It's really quite a spectacle.
Yeah, I will say I did do a study abroad stint when I was in college in Russia, where they had a cabin outside of the city. I think they call them dachas, and I never went to their dacha with them because I had school. And I remember being just absolutely devastated one time because they came back with an entire basket full of chanterelles. And I was so homesick at that point that I was like, you guys, like, please, like, next time take me. And then, of course, I was like leaving the next week. Yeah, it is interesting just because even growing up, having, parents who were in the mushroom business, for lack of a, better word, it was always a little embarrassing because, you go to people who are like, oh, what do your parents do? And they're like, oh, mine's a doctor, mine like works at the foundry. And I'm like, yeah, mine, they're mushrooms. And so it's interesting because now, of course, I think it's the coolest thing. A lot of it is just, completely a cultural thing. And I think there is a shift in the US.
Yeah, especially in social media lately, foraging has become the new hot topic. So I agree. I think it'll be really interesting to see how it goes. Something that I would have also, so this summer, I don't know what it's like for y'all over in Wisconsin, but it is hot and dry. It is a summer drought. And
Ditto.
yeah, I haven't harvested last summer, which was wet here. There was more wine caps to give away to anyone than we know what to do with. This season we've gotten one flush, and that's about it. And so that has me thinking, what is something that we talk about quite a bit is sort of climate resiliency, kind of selecting for in this mostly plants that can still produce a heavy crop in a summer drought. And I'm wondering if there are any strains of mushrooms that kind of can withstand what we've been going through, just no rain for a month.
Yeah, so I would say there are definitely varieties. I would say most varieties can withstand it. It's just they're not going to choose that time to produce mushrooms. So we have, quite a few shiitake logs without forced fruiting them. They're not going to produce a natural fruiting right now just because it's been too hot, it's been too dry. But within that log, the mycelium is protected enough that they will make it through this dry season. With a wine cap bed, it's going to be very dependent on how deep it is. For example, I just created a wine cap bed at my house, and in some places it's 8 inches deep. I dig around in it right now, and there's plenty of healthy mycelium runs. So it's resilient, even though it hasn't been getting rain. I think, in the last 2 months, we just recently got rain, but before that, I would say we had maybe a total of half an inch. It was something very not great. It is not so much that they won't be able to withstand it because it will still be there. It will still be healthy. It's just not going to choose that specific moment to create a fruiting body.
So if you do, though, want to produce a mushroom during the drought, the only really species capable of doing that is shiitake on natural logs, because you can fool them into fruiting that the typhoons are coming by soaking a log in water overnight. And that typically will cause the mushroom to fruit. Throughout the month of June and July has been particularly dry here, or was, we were able to produce a weekly crop of shiitake on natural logs for the farm market. So the weather does play an influence on those people who choose not to force fruit. But boy, if you got a market that wants mushrooms, or you have relatives that are pounding on your door for mushrooms, if you have shiitake logs, you can produce a crop during the heat.
Yeah, I've seen examples of that method in the Woodlanders series that Costa
Boot Sakaris
puts out. Are you familiar with that, you guys?
He had a really good one on shiitake cultivation, and well, it covered everything from tree selection to drying. It was really very, very well done.
Yeah, I guess listeners, if you haven't seen it, Woodlanders on Vimeo, it's Patreon supported. It's the same person who put together the Inhabit, a permaculture perspective documentary. So definitely worth checking out.
So one thing I'd like to ask is, are there any species of either mushrooms that are maybe underutilized that you'd like to see in cultivation more, that you've been experimenting with or would like to experiment with? Or on the flip side, also maybe substrates like different tree species or different types of media that you think is underutilized in the mushroom cultivation community?
Well, it's interesting because I honestly think the most underutilized method of growing is mushrooms on natural logs. The reason I say that is because there's a lot of access to freshly cut wood is difficult to come by if you live in a more urban scape. That being said, there's also a misconception out there about cutting down trees is bad, which, in certain places, yes, it is. With us, it's, we're selectively cutting trees for forest management and forest health to create a better forest setting, a healthy forest stand. So I personally feel like actually production on logs is one of the more underutilized methods of growing mushrooms out there. Joe might have a different answer to that.
Oh, I think you got it nailed. And the beauty of cultivation of mushrooms on logs is that you can grow a lot of different wood types. We have a pretty good database on that. So if you have access to wood, be it through a forestry management practice, via an urban arborist cutting or trimming trees, or a power company clearing a right of way, chances are some of that wood, if not most of it, could be used for mushroom cultivation. And we're not talking just shiitake here. We're talking reishi, lion's mane, namako, chestnut, maitake. The list is fairly extensive that you can grow on all these different wood types. And like I said, we have the data to back it up for specific wood species. So if anybody ever has a question, we have the resources to answer that question of what fungi will grow on what wood.
Are there any general rules of thumb in terms of selecting wood types, like hard being better than conifers, or low amount of oil content? If it's smelly like cedar, maybe it's not as, or pine, it's maybe not as.
Well, if we take a look at, let's call it hardwoods versus softwoods. Softwoods being a coniferous species. So typically we avoid the conifers. There's always exceptions to every rule, though. For instance, jack pine, which is a two-needled hard pine found here in the Lake States, kind of akin to Virginia pine and in the east, and lodgepole pine in the west. We use that to grow namako, because namako seems to have a really wide host range. Now, the hard hardwoods are definitely best suited for shiitake, and that would be oak, sugar maple, ironwood, and trees in that category. And then there's another division called soft hardwoods, which are deciduous trees but with lower density wood. So aspen, tulip poplar, those are really great for oyster mushrooms, because oyster mushrooms prefer the softer hardwoods.
Yeah, so that all being said, there's a lot of different tree species out there, a lot of different ones that you can use for different mushrooms. We do on our website, we have a log species suitability chart that you can find it. So if you're wondering, for example, what you can use tree of heaven for, we have that. So that's definitely a good resource to check out if you are interested in growing on logs.
Man, tree! I never knew that tree of heaven could be used for mushroom cultivation. What an amazing use of an invasive species that everybody. I don't know, I've been in landscape architecture, and so tree of heaven is like a big thing in terms of urban environments and should we keep it invasive question, etc. I never knew it could be used for mushroom cultivation. That's so interesting. So my next question is, in terms of edibility or flavor, in terms of your personal palates, what are some favorites? Our listeners, maybe this is the time to pull up Field and Forest on your cell phone or on your computer and just look at the wide range of mushrooms that are offered to get an idea, or to at least get a visual sort of something to look at while we're talking about this. But yeah, what are some standouts? In terms of flavor, what do you guys like best?
Yeah, so in terms of flavor, the most boring answer that I'm sure Joe and I actually share is shiitake. I love them. I think they have one of the best textures. They have one of the best flavors. They're naturally garlicky, they're chewy, they're phenomenal grilled. They make a very good meat substitute. I did a stint as being a vegetarian when I lived on the East Coast, just because meat was very expensive. And, I just ate a lot of mushrooms, and shiitake was the one I went for. That being said, my secondary is a mushroom called maitake, commonly known as hen of the woods, which is typically a wild foraged mushroom, but we do grow it here as well. And that one, if you toss it in olive oil and some salt and roast it in the oven, it comes out tasting like a potato chip. And that's potatoes are probably my favorite food, so that's a winner in my book too.
Well, you talk about a chip off the old block. I really would have to ditto those comments, but I'm going to throw a curveball out there for all you adventurous folks. One of my favorite mushrooms is actually namako. Namako is a fall fruiting mushroom, typically grown on cherry. So there's a use for cherry wood. Grow namako. It's a fall fruiting mushroom, has a very slimy cap, which turns 90% of the public off to it. But the beauty of it is that when it's used as a soup, it lends this really nice silky texture to a soup, and it has the mushroom itself has a very floral taste to it. So being the big spender that I am, I'll take a package of ramen, toss out the seasoning package, use the noodles, and then put just namako in the broth. And I tell you what, it's an excellent soup, and it's a real seasonal thing just in the fall of the year. Those three top my list: shiitake, maitake, and namako.
And I imagine the salt content is quite a bit less when you throw out the seasoning packet for the ramen.
Yeah, exactly.
It probably tastes a lot better too. Wow, that's that. I'm good. I guess I gotta inoculate some cherry logs. So I saw that wood bluet is another one that is on your website and is something that can be grown in sort of a garden bed setting. And personally, I have to admit, I've been very hesitant isn't the right word, but I just haven't done a lot of log inoculation, because in the context of sort of a not urban but suburban backyard, there's not an incredible lot of shaded space, and really the shaded space that I have is just wood chips. And so I saw on your website that maybe wood bluets from sawdust spawn can also be cultivated in wood chips, and are they similar to wine caps in terms of their fruiting capacity in coming back for a couple of years in the right conditions? That's one I've never grown, and I'd like to introduce it to my landscape.
Yeah, so as far as the fruiting capacity and seasonality, and how many years it will come back, it's really similar to wine cap. The biggest difference is, of course, other than the mushroom itself, is the bed material. Wood likes a more nitrogen rich setting, so it really prefers a bed comprised of lawn clippings, like grass clippings. So you mow your lawn, rake up all your grass clippings and save them for a bluet bed. Leaf litter, chunks of bark are things that really bluet love to feed off of and create a bed. So that one is another really good one. It is strictly a a fall time fruiter. So it does need to have a pretty good temperature drop. We typically see ours in late September, early October here in Wisconsin.
Yeah, bear in mind that it's similar to wine cab. Another big difference though is yields. It's not going to be yielding to a point where you're out of the way, but it does yield enough that it makes it worthwhile to grow. And it adds variety to the palate too.
Yeah, and then another thing to note, not to stray too far away from mushroom bed production, but as far as, this might be important to note for other people who have urban land or, semi-urban settings. I myself have a very, small yard and, I'm surrounded by several houses, don't have a lot of shade. The most shade I get comes from either my house or a lilac bush, which as you can imagine is not, super abundant shade. But something that you can do is you can also mimic shade. A lot of times people will just take an old blanket and throw it over their mushroom logs. And that provides enough shade. And it also, like when it rains, it, it creates this nice little humidity dome around them. So just wanted to mention that it's like a possibility for those who, if they don't have shade, there are ways to artificially create shade and still get moisture to their logs.
So another thing that I've seen posted is a sort of second use of mushroom blocks. And personally, I'm less interested in the mushroom blocks comparatively to how you're using them as a sort of a design element in the landscape. They're like a border for, it's like this companion planting genius idea. Let's use our reishi blocks to put in at the edge of a walkway, I assume, for the beds. That's something that I have thought about for log cultivation. Like, let's say someone decides to build a raised bed and they inoculate it with shiitakes, but it's a budding soil. Is that a bad thing? Most of what I've seen is people cultivating shiitakes or other mushrooms on logs that are very portable. And, part of that is probably for production in terms of forcing them in a river that's nearby or something along those lines. But is there anything wrong with building maybe a hugelkultur mound or a raised bed with hardwood that is the right species for inoculation and then putting plug spawn in that? Or is it a bad thing because it could be totally overwhelmed by some other mycelium or decay too quickly or something that, something I just don't know about?
Well, my take on that would be that if you're going to go through the effort of cultivating any mushroom on a log, there's a lot of work involved with that. So really, you want to try to maximize what you get out of it. And typically that doesn't happen when you put it in contact with soil, because you have then soil wood interface where there's a lot of things going on that I don't understand. So what I would say, and this is what we have seen done quite frequently, is people take, for instance, a shiitake log fruit for a couple of years and then use that to make a raised bed, because they'll still get mushrooms out of it. They've already paid for the spawn that went into it from the mushroom crop they got. So it's just like it's I don't want to call it a value added product, but it certainly is another potential use for a log that is somewhat past its prime.
Yeah, you can definitely use freshly inoculated logs. It's just you would expect the yields to not, possibly not quite be as high as something that you're keeping in its, kind of ideal conditions. And that being said, a lot of people, what they'll do is, for hugelkultur especially, is they'll actually just take chunks of spawn, oyster mushrooms primarily, take chunks of spawn and stick it in the mound, because that will, also produce mushrooms and add some nutrients to it. So it's all definitely doable. It's just, for building a raised bed, like Joe said, using logs that, you might not be using for like a primary production at that point, that you're just using as kind of a value add to that bed, would be the way to go with that.
Gotcha. I kind of imagined that once the soil contact happens, all sorts of weird things might go down, but I wasn't certain if any of those could be like, I mean, my mushroom knowledge is very, very limited, so I wasn't sure if it could be potentially, bad news.
Yeah. I would say there also are certain varieties of mushrooms that would do better for them, varieties that like to be lower to the ground. So olive oysterling is a mushroom that likes to be primarily next to the ground. It doesn't require that much, airflow. And pairing it with a mushroom variety that, does a little bit better in that setting is also a possibility. Something like turkey tail will pretty much outgrow anything. Definitely a possibility, but again, it's all about picking what mushroom will do best in the environment you have chosen for it.
Part of the reason why I think about that is because if somebody is intentionally watering their raised bed during, the summertime and supplementally watering it with a hose or something, the water that's just going on the wood that they have as the structure holding up the bed could be benefiting the mushrooms by sort of forcing it, perhaps, or would that not be enough water to do anything?
Well, that's the $1,000,000 question. I think what that would all boil down to is the wood species itself, the mushroom that's in it, and how often the substrate's watered. So if you keep on watering a log, let's say all season long, you water it every week, it's going to be in a vegetative stage. It's really going to want to decay that wood. So it really is leading the life of Riley. It's decaying wood. There's no stress on it. So it may not fruit, unless you stop watering, it goes through a little bit of dry down, and then you get a drop in temperature with rainfall. And that would really stimulate it to fruit. Now, this whole bed thing, has got me thinking, and that's dangerous. The shiitake, for instance, when we're moving logs in the lane yard, oftentimes we pick up part of the forest soil with it because it does extend its mycelium into the forest floor. So would it be detrimental to use let's say a log that's been inoculated for over a year old, and placed it in direct contact with the soil? It may not be. It may be that it'll grow into the soil and then, of course, add more organic matter to it and make the soil better. But will it shorten the life of the log? That question I don't have an answer to.
Sounds like some interesting future research that could be done. All right, so this is my last question. Well, okay, so there's a few different things here, I guess. When it comes to cultivation of wine caps, I've noticed that the longer that you leave them out, the more pests occur, and you want to harvest them when they're young because there's some sort of little, something or other, maybe a beetle or a fly that like puts its larvae in there, and then I just have to wash out the larvae. I'm sure it would just be extra protein to eat it, but I'm just whatever. I'm not that crunchy, and so I wash out the larvae, and then I eat the wine cap even when it's big. But I also know that slugs love mushrooms, and sometimes I'll see, part of my wine cap, my beautiful wine cap, I'll see it like as a button or almost a button. I'm like, oh, I can give it one more day. And then I come back and then like, there's just half of it missing. And I'm like, did a rabbit do this? Like, what did this? And so when it comes down to mushroom pests, what are your experiences and what are some possible solutions?
Great question. We get this a lot. And I would say that, like you mentioned, picking them young is a huge thing. Picking them young will, that way it just ensures you get to them before the pests do. Another thing is choosing mushroom varieties that grow in cooler temperatures when pests are less abundant. So taking some of those cool weather shiitake strains, or, some of the like oysters that fruit in the cold temperatures, like something like polar white or blue dolphin. So pairing it with a time where pests are less abundant. And then, other than that, it's just getting creative. Slugs are a big problem. And for us, we depending on how much rainfall, this year they haven't been bad, but other years they've decimated our crops. A lot of people have come up with really interesting solutions to getting them. Slugs don't like to crawl across anything that's going to take off their slime. So people will crush up oyster shells and lay those in a ring, a moat around their logs, if you will, and that deters them. So the bigger problems are, something like those, as gnats who like to get in there and you don't even see them. And then you cut open your mushroom and you're like, well, that's gross. It really is, I would say, primarily picking them young and choosing strains that fruit in cooler temperatures.
Yeah, we also do have problems with our mammalian friends. We never had a problem with white-tailed deer probably until about a decade ago, when one found that shiitake actually were edible and quite good. So we have to take precautions now to keep the deer off of our fruiting shiitake. So we use a physical barrier. We use a floating rope cover to protect the mushroom crop from white-tailed deer. And it's interesting, as the mushroom cultivation scene has developed in our lane yard. We've also developed all sorts of, I don't want to call them pests, but they're curious. Red squirrels or pine squirrels love to eat shiitake buttons on the logs in the spring of the year because it's the first fresh bite for them. So there too, when we start seeing a natural crop, we need to cover logs to make that physical barrier to keep the pine squirrels off of it. But other than that, bird peck on sawdust spawn is a problem we see. I think the woodpeckers like the wax on their beaks. So, kind of gives them that wax lip feeling. But other than that, mammalian and avian problems are somewhat limited. And now thinking about it, we just got an email today from somebody saying, hey, the bark is disappearing off my shiitake logs and they're only 8-year-old. What gives? And it was gray squirrels. So, put a crop out there and a pest will find it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you say that about the deer and the buttons, and they're sort of like not immediately recognizing it as food. I have a close friend who was growing a white strawberry as a ground cover in his forest garden and witnessed a chipmunk run right up to it, look straight at this like white fruited, fully ripe strawberry, and then dart away, and thought, okay, like my crop is safe. Like they're not smart enough to recognize that this is not a ripe strawberry. But then a year later, every single chipmunk had figured out that this is like the place. Like it only took a year, and then now there's not a single strawberry to be had for anyone. And who would think that deer would eat shiitake mushrooms? But I guess maybe that one deer told all its friends, man, this is the spot to go.
And the problem we see with deer is that they'll take one bite, ruin that mushroom, and then move down the log and take a bite out of another mushroom. It's not like they're grabbing the whole thing. It's just a bite at a time on a different mushroom. So, if you're doing it from a commercial standpoint, hey, it's just part of the scene. But if you're a homeowner and those are your first 3 mushrooms, boy, what a tragedy that would be.
Yeah, I felt the same way when I harvested my first wine caps and saw 2/3 of the mushroom gone, but I still ate it. It was great. It tasted the same. Well, Phoebe and Joe, thanks so much for joining us today. We should probably wrap things up as we're coming up to the 1 hour mark, or maybe we've just passed it. But yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation. I feel like we've given so much useful information to our listeners, and I certainly learned a few things. I'm sure Ben did too. So thank you again for being here with us. And it's really, really fascinating to learn about all of these intricate details of mushroom cultivation in a forest garden context.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say with, the world of fungi, there's a lot out there. The world, it's an entire kingdom. So, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of different, intricacies to it. So for anyone just getting started, just, know that there are simpler cultivation techniques out there that really anyone can do, no matter what your living situation is. So for anyone that's interested, just know that, you can make it work for whatever resources you have available.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. It's been our pleasure.
Thank you so much, Phoebe and Joe, for joining us. And I hope to one day see you on a mushroom foray in, I guess I'll have to visit Wisconsin. But thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.